I've got quite a few questions. It's
No,
really
just
okay
shoot,
if
just
we
shoot.
don't get through.
No, but just shoot.
But
And let's try and do them.
Make them as long or as short as you like.
Okay.
But you wrote this book. You said in the beginning that it's necessary first to change society's idea of law, which you framed the book as being about that. So the recognition for the need for wild law over the content of what wild law might look like. I wondered if you could start by telling us what jurisprudence is, and frame within that what is Earth Jurisprudence, and how does it relate to the concept of wild law?
Sure. So jurisprudence means the philosophy of law. So I realized, initially I thought that environmental problems are caused by inappropriate human behavior. One of the main tools for regulating human behavior is law. So if you had better laws, you could solve the problem. Then I began to encounter problems which couldn't be solved by drafting better laws. There were philosophical problems underlying laws, and so then I started looking at the jurisprudence. And when I looked at the jurisprudence, and particularly I was influenced by the work of Thomas Berry, it became very clear that the philosophies on which our legal and political and economic systems are based are at best from the age of Enlightenment in the 16th and 17th century in Europe, but they're certainly based on a mechanistic understanding of the world and an anthropocentric understanding of the world. So in relation to nature, the idea is that it's resources which exist for humans to exploit, and when you couple that with the consumerist ideas that the best way of fulfilling yourself as a human being is to maximize your consumption, you end up with very rapid exploitation and degradation of the natural world. So while science in the 16th and 17th century it did adopt this mechanistic idea that the world was like a giant clock or something, science has long since rejected those ideas. So the science has moved on, and whether you look at quantum physics or ecology or genetics, epigenetics, it's very clear that we're an integral part of a highly integrated system, and that you can't deal with the health or well-being of a human being by stopping at the skin. It's highly dependent on the environment, what's outside beyond our skin. Which essentially means that human beings cannot prosper in the long term within a degrading environment. Our well-being is dependent from and derived from our environment. We're not independent from it. So scientifically, I think that it's incontestable that that's the case. But our legal systems were framed at a time when there was a very different worldview. And so the problem is that there's no connection between our legal systems and the systems which govern the universe. So there's no real connection between science and law. So for example, effectively the laws of the physics or chemistry say that if you put X amount of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, you'll destabilize the climate, and there'll be rapid and precipitous change. But there's nothing in the law which recognizes that it's important to stop that happening. So almost all the activities that cause climate change are perfectly legal. And as the levels of greenhouse gas ratchet up in the atmosphere, there isn't an automatic legal device which starts restricting human behaviors to bring it back down again. So in other words, nature works obviously with dynamic balances. As you start getting as you start moving towards an extreme, there'll be forces which will pull the pendulum to swing the other way. We haven't tried to design our legal systems like that. They're designed to maximize exploitation and consumption. So really, to summarize, you could say that our legal systems and our political and economic systems are like colonial systems. They are designed to maximize and legitimize exploitation or taking from nature, and we need to change the purpose of that so that the fundamental purpose is to enable us to live, human beings to live in a mutually harmonious relationship with nature. So to be good Earth citizens, if I can put it that way.
Right. I mean, the one analogy you gave, which was quite powerful to me, was you suggested that a few centuries ago, power was. I think you used Cicero as an example, and it's not absolute power will corrupt absolutely, but something along those lines, where the greater your power is, the greater your responsibility is to use it wisely. And part of that responsibility is mandating you to do certain things. And so we've come a long way within our, what you call the homosphere, in terms of distributing power more evenly. But we haven't crossed that species barrier yet, you say in the book. So we haven't extended that philosophy to the rest of nature.
So Einstein talked about the importance of widening the circle of our compassion. So, and historically you've seen that people start off with just caring about their family or their clan, and then they'll be fair within that, but then everybody else are foreigners and can be killed, and then gradually that circle moves beyond the sort of nuclear family and the clan to the tribe, and then to the nation, and then you get the idea of universal human rights emerging in United Nations, etc., and it moves to the species, and along the way it's included women and people from other races and children who start off not having any rights. So I see this as, very much as you say, as the next step in widening the circle of compassion. And also, Earth Jurisprudence is the idea that we need a non-anthropocentric jurisprudence that's informed by the actual laws of the universe. And the advantage of that is that it would bring law and science into congruity with each other, because in order to, science, for example, is one of our tools by which we understand the rules of nature, if I can put it that way. So the lawyers would have to work very closely with the scientists and the ecologists, etc., to say, okay, how does the system work? What are the important limits that must not be transgressed? And how do we then design means of regulating human behavior to fit in with that?
Right. I got the sense in your book that you were utilizing three values, which we also use in conservation. One is use value, so how is something useful to humans? One is option value, which is let's just preserve it until we see that it has a function for us. For example, cancer treatments that lie in the rainforest. And then one is intrinsic value, which is I found was a strong ethic throughout your book. Would you say you use all three of those value systems in your book? And also, is Earth Jurisprudence based on now and later? And if it's based on later, in what sense is it related to evolution?
So the idea is that it's primarily intrinsic value. In other words, if you say, as soon as you say you're judging the value of something relative to their worth to a human being, you inherently anthropocentric. The hidden assumption is that human beings are the arbiter of value. So another way of saying, somebody once said to me, everything that has come into being has the right to be. So if evolution has, the evolutionary process has produced not just humans but elephants and redwoods and snails, it seems that each of those have a claim to be part of the whole. They exist for a reason. They manage to survive, and they only survive because they play some function in the whole. So the primary value would be that value is determined by the universe, and if you've survived the evolutionary process, then the universe has found you to have value. It's not determined primarily by human beings. The use value things obviously do come into from a practical point of view, but the most important thing is to accept the humility that we don't determine whether we shouldn't be the determiners of what has value, what is entitled to exist and what doesn't. have the right to exist. So yeah, I would say its intrinsic value would be at the heart of it.
Right. And you also talk of
sorry, maybe just I should add a footnote. As far as use value is concerned, obviously it's important. I mean, the whole system ecologically is held together by things eating each other. So it's important that things carry on eating each other, if you know what I mean.
Right. Yes.
So it is definitely use value in that sense. Right. You know, I mean, it's not that I'm saying that one can't eat other things, right, or use them. But it needs to be done in a respectful way and for good reason.
Right. So you did make this point in your book. You said wild law doesn't equate with not using resources.
Yes.
That it's more about rights that are informed by interactions and relationships. And then you gave the example of give and take relationship between two people and how it should be give and take over the long run, that for a short amount of time it might be one person taking more than the other, but that when it becomes destructive or abusive, then that should be stopped. And then you make that analogy with what humans are doing now, to say that it is destructive and abusive. So basically coming back to the use of resources issue, you say it's okay to modify according to needs. So that would lead me to ask you, have you been opposed on grounds that this is just something to say we can't develop and we can't lead our modern lifestyles, and how do you counter that?
Yes, so it is a common thing. Perhaps just before I go into that, some people are talking about these approaches, some academics, particularly in Australia, are referring to them as ecological approaches to law. So that's another way of seeing it. It's seeing, it's trying to really remove the barriers between the laws of ecology and human laws. In other words, human laws are a species-specific articulation or subset of a bigger system. So, but certainly, I mean, a lot of people do oppose it on the basis of sort of training, development, etc. And there are two issues there. One is that it would, of course, have the effect of preventing many things that currently happen from happening. So to the extent that you define those as development, it would have that effect. Personally, I think that the concept of development has become horribly perverted. So the concept of development, as I understood it, referred originally to human development. In other words, like moving up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now it means building roads and nuclear power stations and things like that, regardless, or economic growth, exactly, GDP growth, which is not a measure of human well-being. Right. So if one needs to be conscious of the terms. I mean, Earth Jurisprudence and this approach would increase human well-being over time, and particularly the general human well-being. People would be healthier and happier, I believe, over time. But it would probably decrease consumption and GDP. But there are some really difficult issues, like, for example, computers. You know, they are part of making many good things in life, but or cell phones. But you know, they do use rare earths and things like that. So there are difficult decisions to be made. But if you take a rights-based approach, it's mainly about balancing rights rather than about absolutes. Right. No right is absolute. Right. So it depends on the circumstances. There may be circumstances in which it's fine to mine a rare earth, and there may be circumstances where, because of where it's situated, the costs would be too great and it shouldn't be mined.
Right. It seems to me if it was translated, the spirit of wild law was translated, it would end up with us staying in what is a safe operating space.
Yes.
So that we don't transcend those planetary limits.
Yes.
Like the Stockholm Institute talks about the 9
exactly.
limits. I wondered how closely would you think the ethics, or not the ethics, but the practice of ecological economics, which is a developing field, how much would that arise from an interpretation of wild law?
I know there's some ecological economists in Latin America that are very involved with this. So one is Alberto Acosta. He was the president of the Constitutional Assembly in Ecuador that adopted the constitution recognizing rights of nature. But Alberto is an ecological economist himself, and he's now an academic. I don't know, I'm not familiar with all of the details of their work, but I know he distinguishes himself from environmental economists. And
Right.
so it's very compatible. And there's a paper that came out last month from the United Nations General Assembly on Earth Jurisprudence, which I can give to you. And there's discussion in there about economics a little bit, not that much. So I would see it as very complementary.
Right. It seems as though it would be more empowered if it was supported by a different jurisprudence than the one it currently is.
Yeah. I mean, this is basically thinking that can be applied to every single discipline.
Right.
You know, I just happen to be applying it to law because that's my training.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. In just relating it back to insect ecology, you know, if I was to relate what you called expressing the essential nature of wildness to a conservation situation, I would interpret that as preserving structure and function. What we use those terms, structure and function, to almost understand how ecosystems should work and what they need to work, and that includes abiotic processes or supporting biotic processes.
Yeah.
So for example, I would. You wanted to show me?
No, I was just going to answer your question.
Okay.
Finish and then I'll tell you. I'm just looking for something.
So with insects, for example, they provide a major function in agricultural systems, but also beyond agricultural systems. But agriculture is the biggest user or the biggest transformation of land. I would see wild law as maybe giving legal impetus for agricultural areas to establish environmental networks, what are called environmental networks. I like to think of them as veins running through the body and providing blood to the body, because it allows for meta-populations to exist, which is where populations are connected within the landscape. Insects are less worried about being fragmented than other taxa, for example, because they can fly, but they still nevertheless benefit, and they provide huge benefits for agriculture. So the legal impetus to allow movement through the habitat.
Yeah, this is a very important point because I'm using the term wild to mean the creative forces that have brought the universe into being.
Yeah.
So if you look at the history of the universe, you know, we've gone from the Big Bang through, you know, stars and rock debris to incredible diversity of life we see now. So you can deduce that there's a very creative force that runs through the universe, and I'm calling it wildness, so you could. But it's important that it has a kind of freedom to play, to continue. That's what's brought us into being and brought this amazing world into being. So if we're clever, we would work with it, not against it.
Right.
So wildness is also about flow, and flow. Things can only flow if there's connection.
Right.
So it can flow through, you know, in a sort of abstract way, through people being connected. If people who are isolated, their mental health suffers. But as you've been talking about it through a landscape, it's very important that you maintain those veins, whether they be river courses or whatever, because that's how evolutionary forces flow.
Right.
Gene flows, all kinds of flows, nutrients, food, etc. So wildness and wild law is about maintaining the freedom for that flow, that generative vital forces to continue.
Right.
So I mean, I do agree with your interpretation, and there's so in the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, in Article 1, paragraph 7, it says, "The rights of each being are limited by the rights of other beings, and any conflict between their rights must be resolved in a way that maintains the integrity, balance, and health of Mother Earth." So that comes back to what you were talking about, ecosystem structure, etc. So if one were ever called upon to interpret what that would mean, you would have to take advice from ecologists, for example, about at what point is the integrity, balance, or health being disrupted.
Right.
Because obviously, one of the rights is the right to continue vital cycles and processes free from human disruptions. So it's not free from impacts.
Right.
It's free from fundamental disruptions which affect integrity and functionality.
Right.
And flow. Everything impacts on it, has some impact on an ecosystem.
Right.
But once you start, as you say, affecting the structure and integrity and functioning, then you're starting to degrade.
Right. We're also taught a lot about concepts of disturbance and how some ecosystems require disturbance. For example, we're in a fire-driven ecosystem here.
Yeah.
But disturbance is within the balance. As you say, it's give and take. And disturbance can allow for creation, but after a certain point it doesn't. And you talked in the book about Tucano, the Tucano people.
Yes.
And not only them, but a number of other people you mentioned. I don't know what one calls them, cultures from long ago, perhaps. And these Tucano people regarded it as very important to prevent blockages.
Yes.
And so they perhaps intuitively understood the concept of flow and blockages and what their actions might do to block. And we do have now, as you say, consultation with ecologists. We have the tools and we have the measures and the techniques to quantify that. So
the lawyers don't know that,
and
nor do the economists, etc. Exactly. So it's like there's this huge pool of knowledge about how the planet actually works, and it's isolated from the people who regulate human behavior, and that's what you need to close that gap.
Right.
But if you were trying to regulate human behavior in order to fit in with nature, then you'd obviously consult with those people, ecologists. But that doesn't happen now because that's not the purpose. The purpose is to maximize GDP growth.
Right.
So ecologists are almost irrelevant to that.
Right. That sort of also makes me think of a part in your book where you describe something called natural law. Which was, you'll have to remind me, but it's the idea that there's a certain nature to things, and we should try to preserve that nature. But then it was replaced by non-cognitivism and legal positivism. Do you see wild law as a return, in a sense, to natural law?
Yeah, I would distinguish it from the classical idea of natural law to some extent, but it has a lot of similarities with it. So, I mean, I think that the natural law, as it was originally sort of proposed, was based on a kind of morality that was saying, if you look at nature, animals don't normally kill their own kind, and therefore morally murder is wrong. For humans to kill each other is wrong. So it got criticized because there was a kind of a jump from an observation of nature, which wasn't always accurate, to a moral conclusion. And people pointed out, well, if you're observing something, it doesn't automatically flow that there's a moral conclusion that if the premise is that this is the situation, you can't really get to an ought, therefore you ought to behave in this way. Yeah. So it was a very sort of technical argument, but the fact is, what I would sort of follow in a way in the tradition of natural law, but saying something different, saying you don't have to get into the ought other than to say, as a working hypothesis, if you're part of a system and you play by the rules of the system, or you try and fit in with the system, you're likely to do a lot better over the long term than if you try and work against the system. Right. So you can call that an ought if you like, but to me it's a sort of a reasonable working hypothesis to use unless proved wrong. Right. And so I'm just saying it's the scientific reality is that we're part of the system. We can't disengage from it, and that our well-being is derived from it. Therefore, it's rational to seek to maintain the health and integrity of the whole as a means to achieving it for the person. So, for example, the United Nations, based on what's coming out of South America, South Americans talk about living well in harmony with nature. But the important thing is they really mean living well through living in harmony with nature. So that it's important, attempting to live harmoniously with nature is how you end up living well. Right. Whereas in the West we tend to have the idea that you first live well, and then if you're wealthy enough you look after the environment.
Right. So that makes me think almost as though the use option and intrinsic value are essentially all just one value, because we're not there. There's that illusion that we're separate, but we're in a sense not, because we're part of a whole, and a whole needs all its parts to operate as a whole.
Exactly.
Just very lastly, I'd like to ask you. You created, or you added to a philosophical body of work as to justify why wild law is important. Is there any evidence of entry of these principles into mainstream legal systems? And are there any groups, such as the one you're involved in, working on threshing this out, on what the nuts and bolts interpretation of wild law might be?
Yes. So it's in the constitution in Ecuador. Bolivia has got a law of Mother Earth, and New Zealand in the last year has recognised a national park, a mountainous national park, as passed a law recognising it as a legal entity, a person, and also the Whanganui River in New Zealand has also been recognised as a legal person. There are, I think, I don't know how many, but it's dozens of municipalities in North America that have adopted local bylaws recognise the rights of nature. A lot of indigenous people throughout the world still live by those laws, and it's going very fast. So I can send you this United Nations report that's recently come out. There's also, well, I've just been invited, in fact,
is he here?
No, but actually I must get some water to deal with him. Let me just get somebody else.
Okay.
Walter, so I've just been invited, actually, next week I'm going to Mauritius. There's an ecology conference there, which I didn't know about, and they're working on, I haven't even looked at the program, but they've got to bring 100 people from the Southern African region together to work some school of ecology, and they see rights of nature as one of the major ways forward. And I didn't even know about them. So they're groups. There's Australian Earth Law Alliance, groups in North America. The wild law has been translated into Italian, and it exists in Italian and Turkish and Korean, and just about to be translated. It's just finished being translated into Chinese, but hasn't been published yet. So it is moving very rapidly, not just because of the book, but the book feeds into it. So I think, and for example, well, just two quick points, contemporary points to pick up. We've just written an opinion last week to do with the CITES meeting that's been happening, because what's happening is that everything is getting farmed. So you're getting lions, most lions in southern Africa, about three times as many lions in captivity in southern Africa than wild, and they're being bred for lion bones, etc. So if you don't recognize that wild creatures are allowed to be wild, if you just regard them as property, which is what the law currently does, it's very hard to stop that, because people just say, well, it's my property and I can do with it as I like. So many species of antelope are now being listed under the legislation, the Animal Improvement Act, which is about establishing stud books and breeding like cattle, but they're doing it with antelope. So you have a situation where it's a very real prospect that conservation areas will be converted to farms. They're farming rhino for their horns, and everything becomes, the quality of wildness goes. The animals may exist, but they're playing no ecological function whatsoever. So as people recognizing that there aren't tools in the existing legal system to stop that, they're starting to move towards these kind of ideas. And also, if just thinking about it from a perspective of insect, somebody once asked me about, how would it apply to bees or something like that. But, first of all, obviously insects would have the right to be, but also, in a sense, if you look at the language of pesticide advertising, etc., it's equivalent of hate speech against insects.
Right.
It's genocidal.
Yeah.
It always uses the language of war and extermination, kill every last one, and so the idea of integrated pest management is not how the average person sees insects. They see it in terms of they would like to kill every last one.
Right.
The Americans talk about bugs and things like that. It's a terrible. It's sort of genocidal colonialism.
Right.
So the idea with this is also what makes it hard for people to move to this is that it's not just getting people to accept a new idea, it's getting people to shift to a new paradigm. Right. To move from an anthropocentric to a non-anthropocentric paradigm is very difficult, as in with changing any paradigm. So it's an intergenerational project. It's a project at least as big as introducing the concept of human rights. Right. So it's not something it's something will be long and even moves fast at times. It's a project of many generations, I think.